Lezong. Speaking of Lezong, he was from Xi'an. His father died before he was born, and he was a posthumous son. My mother believes in Buddhism and will never eat meat or wine. When Lezong grew up, he could eat and drink well. Although he did not dare to say so, he laughed at his mother for being stupid. He often offered sweet and fat things to persuade her to enjoy, but she always scolded and rejected her. Later, my mother fell ill and was dying. She suddenly wanted to eat meat. Lezong was anxious to find it, so he cut a piece of meat from his left leg and presented it to his mother. After my mother ate it, her illness improved slightly, but she regretted breaking the precepts, refused to eat or drink, and died on a hunger strike. Lezong was in agony and thought that his mother had regretted her death because she ate his own flesh. He couldn't help but angrily stabbed his right leg with a knife until the bones were exposed. The family members rushed to rescue him. I applied medicine and bandaged it again, but fortunately, it didn't take long for me to recover. I was thinking about my mother's lifelong observance and suffering, and I was sad that my mother was too stupid. In a fit of anger, I burned the Buddha statue that my mother had enshrined during her lifetime, erected a memorial tablet to her, and offered sacrifices to her in the morning and evening. Often when drunk, he would cry bitterly in front of the memorial tablet. Later, when Lezong grew up to 20 years old, he got married and took a wife. At this time, he was still a virgin. 3 days after the marriage, he told people, "It is the most filthy thing in the world for a man and a woman to live together in the same room. I really don't feel any happiness." He divorced his wife and returned to her parents' home. Gu Wenyuan, his father-in-law, made 3 or 4 trips to beg his relatives to intercede, but Lezong refused. After a delay of half a year, Gu Wenyuan had no choice but to let his daughter remarry. Lezong had been a bachelor for 20 years, and his behavior became even more wild and unruly. Whether they were slaves, actors or musicians, he was willing to drink with them. Relatives and neighbors came to ask for money, and he did not hesitate. One man said that when he married his daughter, she still needed an iron pot, so he took off the pot from his own stove and gave it to her. From then on, he had to borrow a neighbor's pot to cook. Those scoundrels figured out his temperament and often came to deceive him. There was a gambler who had no capital for gambling, so he ran to him and squeezed a few tares, saying that his family had no money to pay taxes and the government was pressing hard, so he had no choice but to sell his son. When Lezong heard about it, he really invested all his money and gave him all the tax money. When the official tax collection arrived at his door, he had no choice but to pawn his property and make preparations. As a result, Lezong became increasingly poor. Previously, when Lezong was still very wealthy, his fellow disciples were all vying to serve him. They were allowed to take whatever they had at home, but Lezong didn't care. When the family's financial situation deteriorated, the nephews stopped visiting the family. Lezong was open-minded and didn't take it to heart. One time, on the anniversary of his mother's death, Lezong happened to be ill and could not visit the grave. He planned to ask a nephew to pay homage on his behalf, but those people all made excuses to refuse, and no one wanted to go. Lezong had no choice but to offer sacrifices indoors, and cried bitterly in front of his mother's memorial tablet. The sorrow of having no heirs lingered in his heart, making his illness more serious. While in a coma, I felt someone touching me. When I opened my eyes slightly, I saw that it was my mother. Lezong asked in surprise, "Why is mother here?" His mother replied, "No one visited my grave, so I came to the house to enjoy the sacrifice and check on your illness." Lezong asked again, "Where has mother been paying attention?" The answer was, "South China Sea." After his mother finished stroking him, Lezong felt cool and comfortable all over his body. When he opened his eyes, he saw that there was no one in the room, but his illness was healed. After Lezong recovered, he determined to go to the South China Sea to worship. It happened that there was a Zhang in a neighboring village who went to Nanhai. So Lezong sold 10 acres of land and took the money to plead to join the Zhang. The people in the Zhang thought he was unclean and rejected him. Lezong had no choice but to follow them on the road. Along the way, he ate wine, meat, leeks, and garlic, which made everyone hate him even more. When he was drunk and fell asleep, everyone left without saying goodbye, leaving Lezong walking alone. When he walked to Fujian, he met a friend who invited him to drink. A famous prostitute named Chonghua was also present. Lezong talked about going to the South China Sea, and Chonghua was willing to go together. Lezong was overjoyed, packed his bags, and continued south with her. Although the two lived and ate together, they never had an affair. When he arrived at Nanhai, the people in the Shang society laughed at him even more. When they saw that he had brought a prostitute, and they disdainfully disdained to worship with them. Yi'er Zhong and Chonghua understood everyone's intention and allowed them to finish their prayers first before doing so themselves. When everyone worshipped, there was no sign in the sea, and they were very angry. When the two of them bowed, as soon as they knelt on the ground, they suddenly saw lotus pedestals all over the sea, with strings of necklaces hanging from the pedestals. Chonghua saw that the people sitting on them were all bodhisattvas, but Lezong saw his mother sitting on every Buddha seat. He hurriedly shouted and jumped into the sea, and ran towards his mother. Everyone saw thousands of lotus flowers, which suddenly turned into brilliant clouds, covering the entire sea like brocade. After a while, the clouds calmed down, and everything disappeared. Lezong was still on the coast. He didn't know how he came out of the sea. His clothes and shoes were not wet at all. Lezong looked at the sea and cried loudly. The sound shook the island. Chonghua supported him and persuaded him in every possible way, and he couldn't help but shed tears. After the two worshipped, they sailed back north. A wealthy man on the road called Chonghua. Lezong was staying in a hotel when he saw a child, about 8 or 9 years old, begging in a shop. He didn't look like a beggar. Lezong stepped forward and inquired carefully, and felt very pitiful when he learned that he was a street child who had been driven out of the house by his stepmother. The child clung to him, begging for help, and Lezong took him back home. Asked the child's surname, he replied, "My name is Asin, my surname is Yang, and my mother's surname is Gu. I once heard my mother say that she gave birth to me 6 months after marrying Yang, and my surname is Le." Lezong was shocked and suspected that he had only lived with his original wife Gu once in his life, and could not have a son. So he asked the child where his hometown was. The child replied, "I don't know. But when my mother died, she left me to write a letter and asked not to lose it." Lezong hurriedly asked for the letter, and when he saw it, it turned out to be a document of divorce written by him to the Gu family. He was shocked and said, "It's really my son." He also asked and found out that the year, month, and time of the child's birth were consistent, and he felt very relieved. But from then on, the family's financial situation became increasingly difficult, and after 2 years, all the land was sold. No more servants could be hired. One day, the father and son were cooking, and suddenly a beautiful woman walked into the house. When she saw it, she turned out to be Chonghua. Lezong was surprised and asked, "Why are you here?" Chonghua said with a smile, "We have already become a fake couple, so why ask? I didn't come with you before because there was an old lady at home. Now she is dead. I thought that if I don't follow someone, I won't be able to protect myself. If I follow someone, I won't be able to protect myself. The only way to get the best of both worlds is to follow you, so I traveled thousands of miles to come here." After that, he put down his luggage and cooked for Asin. Lezong was very happy. At night, father and son slept together as usual and cleaned another room for Chonghua to stay in. Asin also recognized her as her mother, and Chonghua treated him like his own son. After hearing about it, relatives and friends all gave Lezong and Chonghua food as gifts, according to wedding etiquette, and they both accepted it happily. When guests came to his house, Chonghua always hosted a sumptuous banquet, and Lezong never asked where the food and wine came from. Gradually, Chonghua took out gold, beads, etc. He redeemed his original property, bought livestock and servants, and his life became more prosperous and lively day by day. Lejong often said to Chonghua, "When I'm drunk, you have to stay away, and don't let me see me." Chonghua agreed with a smile. One day, Lejong was drunk and called Chonghua eagerly, but Chonghua dressed up to greet him. Lejong looked at it with drunken eyes for a long time, and suddenly danced happily, and said, "I understand." He suddenly woke up and felt that the world was bright, and the huts he lived in turned into beautiful buildings and jade houses. After a while, they returned to their original state. From then on, Lejong never went out to drink, but drank in front of Chonghua every day. Chonghua was a vegetarian and was accompanied by tea. Once, Lezong was slightly drunk and asked Chonghua to massage his thigh. Chonghua was very surprised when he saw that the scar on his leg turned into 2 red lotus flowers, faintly protruding from the flesh. Lezong said with a smile, "When these 2 lotus flowers bloom, it will be time for you and I to break up as a fake couple of 20 years. Chonghua was convinced. After marrying a Sin, Chonghua gradually entrusted the housework to his daughter-in-law, and lived in a separate courtyard with Lezong. The son and daughter-in-law visit each other once every 3 days. They are not told any difficult or important matters at home. They only use 2 slaves, one to warm the wine and the other to cook the tea. One day, Chonghua went to his son's place. His daughter-in-law reported and asked for instructions on many housework matters, and then went to see her father together. Entering the door, I saw my father sitting on the couch with bare feet. Hearing the sound, he opened his eyes and said with a smile, "You are all here, good." After that, he closed his eyes. Chonghua was shocked and asked, "What are you going to do?" Looking at his legs, he saw lotus flowers blooming. When he tried his hands on his mouth, he found that he was dead. Chonghua hurriedly twisted the lotus flowers together and prayed, "I traveled thousands of miles to follow you. It's not easy. I also taught your sons and wives, which is also a bit of credit. It's only 2 or 3 years away. Why not wait a moment?" After a while, Lejong suddenly opened his eyes again, and said with a smile, "You have your own things to do. Why bother dragging others with you? I have no choice but to stay here for you." Chonghua listened. After saying that, he let go of his hand and saw the lotus flower closed again. So the 2 of them talked and laughed as before. More than 3 years later, Chonghua was already in his 40s and still looked like he was in his 20s. One day, he suddenly said to Lejong, "After a person dies, it is unsightly and unclean to have his head and feet lifted by others." So he hired a carpenter to make 2 coffins. A Sin asked in horror, "Why?" Chonghua replied, "This is not something you can know." After the coffin was made, Chonghua took a shower and dressed up. He called his son and daughter-in-law to him and said, "I'm going to die." A Sin cried loudly and said, "Thanks to my mother's livelihood these years, the whole family has not suffered from hunger and cold. Mother, you haven't enjoyed a few days of happiness. Why did you leave your son to go?" Chonghua said, "The father sows the blessings, and the son enjoys them. The servants, cattle and horses in our family are all debt sheets to repay your father, and I have no credit. I was originally a goddess of scattered flowers. I accidentally thought of the mortal world, and was demoted to the human world for 30 years. Now, the time limit has expired." After saying that, he entered the coffin and lay down. When he screamed again, his eyes were already closed. A Sin cried loudly and went to tell his father, only to see that his father had died at some point, but he was still fully dressed. Shin was so grief-stricken that he put his father into another coffin and placed it side by side with his mother in the hall. "I didn't mourn for several days, hoping that my father would survive." At this time, a bright light was seen emanating from his father's legs, illuminating the whole house. The fragrance inside Chonghua's coffin was emitting, and even the neighbors could smell it. After the coffin was closed, the aroma and light gradually disappeared. After they were buried, The children of the Le family coveted Le Zhong's property and plotted to drive Asin away. They sued the government and started a lawsuit, saying that Asin was not from the Le family. The government couldn't tell the difference and planned to give half of Le Zhong's family property to Le's children. Asin refused to accept the case and took the case to the county, but still could not get a verdict for a long time. At first, Gu Wenyuan remarried his daughter to a man named Yang. After more than a year, Yang lived in Fujian, and the news was cut off. Gu Wenyuan was old and had no son. He missed his daughter very much, so he went to visit his son-in-law's house, only to learn that his daughter was dead. His nephew was kicked out of the house, and he was living somewhere unknown. Gu Wenyuan was furious, wrote a complaint, and sued the government. Yang was afraid and bribed Gu Wenyuan with property. Gu Wenyuan didn't want it and insisted on getting his nephew back. Yang searched everywhere but still found no whereabouts. One day, Gu Wenyuan was walking on the road by chance and saw a float approaching, so he stepped aside. A beautiful woman in the car shouted, "Aren't you Mr. Gu?" Gu Wenyuan hurriedly agreed. The woman said, "Your nephew has become my son. Now, Leia, please stop filing lawsuits. Your nephew is in trouble. You have to hurry up. Go." Just as Gu Wenyuan was about to ask carefully, the float had already run away. Gu Wenyuan accepted Yang's belongings and hurried to Xi'an. At this time, the Le family's lawsuit was in full swing. Gu Wenyuan surrendered to the government and told the date when his daughter was divorced and returned to her parents' home, the date when she remarried, and the exact time when her son was born. It was very clear and conclusive. Then the truth was revealed. The Le family children were beaten up and driven out of the lobby, and the case was finally closed. After returning home, Gu Wenyuan recounted that the day he saw the beauty was the day Chong Hua died. Asin then asked Gu Wenyuan to move to his home and gave him a house and slaves. Until he was over 60 years old, Gu Wenyuan gave birth to another son, and Asin always treated this little uncle very favorably.
Alright, this story has come to an end. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you.